But on a little bit lighter note, we're going to talk about noise. I did bring in a noise level meter, and I'll have some time to pass this around. I'll turn it on so you can see and kind of pick up my voice as it gets further back. It's based on a log scale, and we'll talk about some of the mechanics of it. But this is one of my cheaper ones. I didn't pass around the light meter because, one, they're very expensive. I had two of them, and unfortunately, they're not well built. And if you just bend one of the little pins, you completely mess up the light meter, and you have to kind of hold it a certain way to get the darn thing to work. So I'm down to one light meter, and that's being a little flaky lately, so I'll have to get that thing sent in. And unfortunately, the repair is sometimes more than the darn instrument cost itself. This thing, though, is from Radio Shack, so I'm not that worried about it. It's not that expensive, but it's a good survey meter. And I'm going to bring it down to about conversational range, which is usually between about 60 and 70. And so as I'm talking, by the way, the hygienists know this, but when you measure, you don't measure like this. You measure up like this. It's perpendicular is where basically the noise comes across this way and captures, and it picks up the noise. So if you're talking, and the voice that I have right now is slightly louder than if we were just 3 feet away. I wouldn't have to talk that loud. But because I'm projecting, I have to pick my voice up a little bit. And we're in the high 60s, low 70s, according to this digital meter right here. And it's kind of fun. It has a minimum, maximum values, weighting values. This is going to be on a dBA scale, which is closest to the ear. People who are really in this stuff, the engineer side of the equation, they usually actually go with a flat scale. Because it actually gives you a truer response to what the human ear is looking at in terms of the acoustics. But for the simple stuff, it's a dBA scale, not a dB, not a dBA or dBc, but a dBA. Okay, so keep that in mind because that's a quiz question. So I'll pass that around so you can see what that looks like. Don't start singing into it. It doesn't record, so. So when we look at noise, it's a displacement of molecules in air as a result of vibrations from a source that set a pressure wave to your ear. It's unwanted sound, and that's really the definition right there of what noise is. Because would you classify music as noise? Some people would if they don't want to hear your music, but you wouldn't classify it as noise because you want to hear that. So really the definition here is unwanted sound. Can annoy and prevent communications, and eventually cause damage to the human hearing mechanism. And a lot's been said about that, especially with the earbuds that you have and the music that you listen to and so on and so forth. And they've gotten better about basically not letting you amp up the music so loud in your ears where it causes a hearing loss. But the difference is if you do crank it up and you're above 85 or so dBA, and the length of time in which you listen to the music, that may be another issue. So now the issue is duration, because the early boxes that came out, the Sony Walkmans and so on and so forth, didn't have the battery capacity or the storage to be able to play that much music, and so you wouldn't have it in your ears as long. Now you can put your phone in your ears, or your iPod or any listening device you want, and listen to as much music as you want. You can pretty much almost go 24/7. With the capabilities today. So now it's a duration issue as well as a volume issue. So sound basics, we look at a sound pressure. It's measured in decibels, and it's against a reference level. Speed of sound in air is Mach 1, or about 1130 feet per second, 1130 feet per second. In water, it moves a lot faster, 4,700 feet per second. In steel, even faster yet, at 16,500. So the distance traveled by a sound wave is a single pressure cycle, and it's noted by this, where C is speed, F is frequency, and lambda is wavelength. And we note that 440 hertz, that's the speed of sound air at 1130 per second. And then if you wanted to look at the wavelength, then you could solve for this particular calculation. So you may want to just quickly do that, because that may come up a little bit later as a quiz question. So in going through this, right here, if you look at 1130 feet per second equals 440 feet per second times the wavelength. Right there, eventually the wavelength then for that sound wave is about 2.57 feet is what we're looking at. So sound waves are fairly long. So remember when I showed you an electromagnetic spectrum, what we're looking at with visible waves, and we're looking at infrared waves and UV waves and so on. So our sound waves now are much longer, and it should be alerting you that if they are long waves, then there actually are ways in which they can be controlled. The shorter the wave, the easier it is to control. The longer the wave, the harder it is to control. So, for example, if you are an apartment building next to a freeway, you may be able to design it in such a way that your doors, the acoustics, the windows design, you can be able to basically block most of the noise. Or you're in a hotel room and you're next to an elevator, or by an ice machine. By the way, I'll avoid those if you can if you're a light sleeper. I'm a very light sleeper. I always request corner rooms if I can, away from all the noise. But most of this stuff can be controlled if you're in a quality hotel or you're in a quality apartment building next to a freeway. But one of the things you can control are the really long wavelengths associated with vibration. So road traffic, tire noise, and the sounds of vibration as it transmits through the pavement and through the earth to your building are very, very hard to control. And so you're going to hear always that rumbling sound in the background. And you say, what's that? That's noise, that's sound, but it's the longer wavelength that's penetrating through because it's just so hard to engineer out. Shorter ones are easier. Range of human hearing is 20 hertz to 20,000, so that's a great range. Wavelength. So if we're looking at wavelengths here, in 20,000 hertz, we're looking at very, very high pitches, right, in terms of. So if we look at 20, 4,000, and 20,000, 4,000, 4 to 6,000, we're looking at is basically that wavelength in which we hear conversations. It can go up higher, such as a cry of a baby, or it can go lower. In fact, there can be very high pitches, which you don't hear, but dogs can hear because they can get outside that 20,000 hertz range. So if we wanted to solve for this in 20,000 hertz, we're really looking at a very short wavelength here of about 0.283 feet. So very short wavelength, and as I mentioned, as you come down like 4,000, it's going to be longer and so on, so you can calculate this. So the hearing process then, sound is collected by the outer ear. It translates to mechanical motion in the eardrum. Then the mechanical motion is transmitted by the ossicles. These are the tiniest little bones in your body, right, which is the malleus, the incus, and the stapes, to the oval window. And then this creates a disturbance of fluid in the cochlea. And inside the cochlea is where a lot of the hearing loss occurs because of the destruction of the hair cells that are in the cochlea, and they transform the fluid disturbance into a nerve impulse into the brain. So long term, where you have these hearing losses, so the acute stuff is all going to be on the other side of the eardrum. The long-term damage that you hear, like the nerve damage and so on, for example, that you would get from long duration of high noises, is really going to be in the cochlea, and it's going to affect the hair cells. And it's basically, it's almost like what you saw I don't know if any of you have seen that footage in the Philippines. It's like that, the new normal there, with hardly any hurricanes, and in our neck of the woods this year, very few. Yet when you go to the South Pacific and you go out to the Philippines and so on, they have had almost twice as many as they normally have. And this one, they just hit them dead center, right? Just completely. I feel really, really bad about the folks there in the Philippines. But the reason the idea comes up is they were showing before and after pictures of all the palm trees, and they're completely wiped out, just laid out. Well, this is very much like it looks like in the cochlea in terms of those hair cells, basically getting mowed down, if you will, and deteriorating, so that they can no longer respond to noise coming in, nerve impulses for you to hear the noise. So the three-part process then is your source that radiates the energy, your path, and this is when the energy travels, and then the receiver, and that's the human ear. So this is the three-part process then is you have to have the sound, it has to travel through a medium, and then you have to be able to register that in terms of what we hear. So this is a nice little cross-section of the ear, the external part of the ear canal, eardrum, and then here's our cochlea on this side here, and that's the business end of what helps us distinguish what we hear in terms of high, medium, and low pitch. And these are the cells that I was talking about right here, inside the cochlea. These are the ones that usually get damaged, right here in terms of the hearing loss. That's, for me, this is what I lost in terms of hearing. So in a room where I don't have a lot of reverberation issues and so on, like for example, that's one of the reasons why I've asked you to be respectful to your classmates and to me and to the guest speakers by not speaking, is that the more talking that's going on, the crosstalk, there's more reverberation, and I can't clearly hear you if you're asking questions because of background noise. I'm especially vulnerable in places where there are lots of people gathered and they're all talking, like maybe like a bar scene or something of that nature. It's not good. I directly have to be in front of you carrying on this conversation. If you have really good hearing, you can actually hear other people talking around you and hear those conversations at the same time. As I've lost that ability to hear, I realize how much of a blessing it is to have that. So if you've got it, preserve it because it doesn't come back once it's lost. Rarely do you have the hair cells affected back in this part of the cochlea. In terms of decibels, the 11 decibels there is dimensionless unit. It's based on logarithm measured by the quantity of the reference here. So here we're having the log of this in terms of decibels. Here's our multipliers, 10s or 20s, because it's in log form. And A measures quantity, B is your reference in quantity. And so this is, because it's a log scale, you can see the differences in terms of scales. So in terms of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 on a log scale for the intensity of noise. So when you hear my conversation and then I come back to you and I say, well, if I've gone to 60 to 70, that's on a log scale. That's not an increase of 10. If I go to 70, 80, another log. So when we get up to 100, 110, 120, we are getting to some very high pressure levels like jet engine noises and so on, and that is very damaging. It's about the intensity, right, of what you're getting in terms of that sound and its wavelength. So noise surveys then. There's specific information on existing noise levels in the workplace. So the idea is to get baseline values. Not so hard anymore. There are lots of places. I know all the bigger companies around here actually do annual surveys and so on, where they have a sound booth where you can get into it and listen to the noise values. How many of you have had a hearing test? Almost all of you have had hearing tests in your schools, mostly, or just part of your employment? A lot of the times, the employment is not only to make sure that you aren't having any damage. A lot of times, to set baseline for these companies to make sure that you don't come in there already with an issue and then come back with a claim that you've got a loss, because it takes time for that to pan out, unless it's really high noise over a short period of time. Then it can make a difference. So you have guidelines for controls, define the areas where you're going to have hearing protection, and then you do area measurements. And I mentioned that's A-weighted, right? So that sound, who's got the sound level meter here? Who's got? So as you can see right there, holding up and take that measurements. Go ahead and what am I picking up? What do you got to hold it up like this. What are you picking up? You got to look at it. What are you picking up in terms of sound level? For me talking right now, I'm going to keep talking till you get another. What's the level? Okay. Okay. So go ahead and set it now. What are you getting? No, get it. You have to probably go down to 60 for this thing to pick up, right? So rotate it all the way down to 60. Can you pick me up now? Okay. What are you picking me up at? 64. Okay. So if I get closer, that's going to go up a little bit higher. Most likely, it'll probably be closer to 70 or so on, maybe 72 based on my projection right there. So you set the dial according to what you're picking up. So in an environment, then you would move that noise level around, you record that information. These days, if you're being inventive, an easy thing to do would be basically have that meter go up there. You're measuring the noise and hold out your cell phone or your iPhone, right, and then like take a picture of it. Now you have basically, especially if you're outside, you've got GPS coordinates already with that. You've got your picture of the noise, which you basically shot back to yourself, and your location. So you have person, place, and time. So, I mean, talk about a low-cost noise survey, really easy to do. Or if you're inside of a building and you're moving around, just, basically note the coordinates of where you are relative to that environment. And it's an easy thing to do in terms of a noise survey. So just be a little creative about that, and then you can make notes about your area measurements and where you took them and when you took them. Workstation measurements, measured, it's above 80 dB. Then you evaluate the individual workstation. Then there's, obviously, I talked about duration a little bit, and then there's dosimeters. Dosimeters are those that will measure your overall noise exposure over time. So this one's giving us an instantaneous response. The idea was that you could put one of these about that size on your belt, have it clipped to your lapel. The technique there is if you're right-handed or left-handed, you're working with machinery. If you're right-handed, you put it on the right lapel. If you're left-handed, you put it on the left lapel. Why? Because you're engaging with that machine, getting closer to it this way if you're right-handed, and this way if you're left-handed. So these are things that are taught to the hygienist when they're doing things. But when you're out there and you see someone do that, and if they're just just clipping it anywhere, you say, I'm not sure this person really knows what they're doing. So you do that because you want to be within the zone of what they're hearing. So log scale, as I mentioned, there are various weightings. And the A weighting, of course, approximates the ear's response. The B is designed for equal loudness curves from the median sound pressure levels, and the C designed for equal loudness curves for high pressure sound levels. So I'm not going to hold you responsible for knowing the difference between A, B, and C, because this is not really a hygiene class, but I will hold you responsible for knowing that if you are going to take measurements, that the A scale is the one that's preferred over the other two because it's closest to what the ear responds to. Above 1,000 hertz, all weightings are approximately equivalent. Definitions in action level, the 8-hour time-weighted average, 85 dB, is measured on the A scale, slow response, and this is a dose of 50%. Audiograms, this is a chart and a graph, and you all have had these showing you your individual results. An audiologist, that's a professional who does this kind of work. And your baseline audiogram, I talked a little bit about that. They're going to measure that in terms of your future audiograms. Your criterion sound level, this is a sound level of 90 decibels is what we're looking at right here. You don't want to be above that because you have to control for it. And then your dB is a unit of measurement for sound level. So all the rest of these just come into play. Your hertz, that's measurement of frequency. Your noise dose. This is a temporary threshold shifts and permanent threshold shifts based on 90 dB criteria. You have your noise dosimeters, which are being passed around right now. You have your representative exposures, your sound levels. 10 times the common logarithm of the ratio of the square of the measured A-weighted sound. Don't worry about all that's mentioned right there. Just know that the unit is in decibels, it's in logs, and that it's a unitless form. Okay, that's all you need to know. Octave band analysis gives you frequencies from low, medium, and high. It can tell you exactly. And these are used a lot of times in terms of engineering controls. You're trying to design an enclosure or figure out what you're doing. If you see the predominant sound as being low frequency, those longer waves, you're going to have a much tougher time controlling it than if it's a higher frequency. Time-weighted average, I mentioned that to you. The sound levels is constant over an 8-hour period. And then those are measured by dosimeters, so they just average that sound over that period of time. Non-auditory effects of noise reduces your efficiency and task, upsets your sense of balance, raises blood pressure, causes pupils to dilate, people become more nervous, you can become more irritable, adds to overall stress of living. All these have been documented in the literature. Speech interference then, sound levels of 500,000, 2,000, 4,000 hertz, also known as preferred speech interference levels. Typical conversation at 60 dB, which is I was talking about a little bit earlier. 80 dB needs to talk very loudly, and 85 to 90 you need to shout. Really bring it up and pick it up to 90. So if you're shouting in a public place and you're not that far away from your colleague or person, that's not a good thing because the surrounding noise is so loud that you actually have to pick your voice up to about the equivalent level in order to converse. This is a typical audiogram that shows noise loss. So hearing level going across from 200 all the way up to about 8,000. This is the left ear and the right ear showing the information about conductive and sensorineural hearing loss. So as we go across, one of the notches that you see right here is conductive hearing loss. This is basically bone conduction, where we basically have a mechanical disconnect in terms of that particular hearing function, whereas this is sensorineural. This is basically the nerve damage that's occurred, as I talked to you about in terms of the cochlea and the loss of those hearing cells, and this is what's called the notch right here. So that's an important one to make sure you get this right there. That's a hearing notch, and then unfortunately, this is this is the area where conversation takes place. So that's why people pay attention to it, because it's unfortunately you lose your ability to hear clearly. More facts. This is our range I talked about. Our conversation, 300 to 4,000. That sweet spot's right about there. It's actually usually about 3 to about 5,000 where you see it. Most occupational hearing loss occurs at higher frequencies after prolonged exposure. Loss begins and is typical at about 4,000 hertz, as I mentioned. Generally, impulse noise is more damage than steady state noise, so use of jackhammers and so on, or loud bursts of noise. Industrial noise often contains about 2 to 5 kilohertz peaks. When we look at the muscle that connects to the stapes, in the stretching muscle of the eardrum, it can't react quickly enough to increase the stiffness of the linkage, and as a result of that, that's where this impact noise does most of the damage, because the bones cannot react quickly enough, and the muscles that connect to those small little bones are not reacting. Impulse noise then varies at intervals of 1 second or less is considered continuous. So if you get like a loud boom or a pop, and then there's nothing, that's your impulse noise. If it's a series of those booms happening at 1 second or less, it's considered continuous because of the human response, the ear to that noise. Types of hearing loss. We have conductive, sensorineural, mixed, brain-related, and psychogenic. The conductive is a mechanism of the outer ear is impaired. The structure of the inner ear is functioning fine. So remember I talked about that disconnect, that mechanical disconnect. The sensorineural, this is hearing loss due to the inner ear damage, and this is primarily at the cochlea. Mixed is a combination of conductive and sensorineural. So this is a mechanical issue as well as something that is connected with sensorineural. So this might be something would be a loud explosion, for example, so that mechanically there was an injury, say bursting of the eardrum, but it was so loud that it also caused damage in the cochlea. So that's where your mix would be. Brain-related, sound is not properly interpreted by the brain, so what you hear is not, what is being said is not what you hear. You're misinterpreting that. And then psychogenic is the problems in which you do not want to hear. So psychological problems in which you do not want to hear things. So someone would say, well, that's just, teenagers, passing into adulthood. But no, the psychogenic stuff comes along when someone's talking to you and you just mentally, for whatever reason, will block it out. And you just don't, you might hear somebody saying something and interpret it totally differently, even though if you were to play the recording back, you say, well, that's not what I heard. I heard something different. Noise exposure can be conductive, sensorineural, as I mentioned. There's a temporary threshold shift. I'll hold you responsible for that, and a permanent threshold shift. The temporary threshold shift is brief exposure to high-intensity sound. It diminishes with rest and recovery. It's about 14 hours before that goes through. I don't know how many of you have been, like if you've gone to the fireworks or if you've gone to the firing range or something of that nature. If you're not wearing hearing protection and you have this ringing sound in your ears, that ringing sound is not a good thing. That's a bad thing, especially if it happens more than once. So that's typically, and many of you have probably experienced ringing in your ears at one point with a loud noise, right? and you say, wow, that's weird, you know, and you know that this was damaging to your ears. The good news is it's a temporary assault, you know, on the ears, but if you continue that, then you're going to start to lose your hearing, and you're going to lose it pretty quickly. Permanent threshold shift, you've lost it because you've been constantly exposed to it, crossed over by overexposure, high-intensity sound. Recovery is not complete, which means you've got hearing loss. Exposure to noise in individual environments deteriorates hearing within 5 to 10 years, the beginning of employment. So it's really about, you know, 5 years down the road, you're going to begin to notice a loss of hearing for high noise environments. Threshold shifts, less than 5 dB result difficult to measure due to the instrument individual variability. Presbycusis, this is your hearing ability diminishes with age. Socioacusis, non-occupational loss by sounds created by modern society. This is that, you know, listening to your iPods and so on at a high level. Ototoxins here usually act on the cochlea, so this is medicine that you would be taking. So first your high frequency goes and then follows and basically works its way through the cochlea, destroying all the cells in the ear. So watch out for the meds that are out there because they can cause serious problems as well. And tinnitus, that's that ringing in the ears, that's what that's called, and I'll hold you responsible for that. Can be caused by aspirin and any other aspirin quality drugs that are out there over time. So watch out in terms of taking high amounts of aspirin. Little baby bear aspirins for heart healthy aspects are not an issue, but taking a lot of aspirin for constant headaches and so on and so forth can cause these kinds of issues in terms of hearing loss. Audiometry, how we measure things. Record of hearing threshold frequencies. We set things to 0. The example of a threshold of 25 dB at 4 kilohertz indicates the individual's hearing is poor, and the standard level of 25 kilohertz at 4 kilohertz as your reference. So a negative threshold indicates better than standard, and then of course the positive means you're poor than that. And standard thresholds an average of 10 dB or greater at 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 hertz. They test both ears, and then as I mentioned, presbycusis may be subtracted from current hearing threshold levels. NIOSH recommends a 15 dB change without age adjustment. 14 hours of noise exposure under 80 dB is required before you do any audiometry test. So these are all things that go into play when you're looking at it. So keep in mind, presbycusis then obviously is that thing I talked about, is you start to have a hearing loss as you age up, but it's accelerated if you're exposed to higher noises in the process of aging up, but in particular at your age when you're exposed to these things. Noise-induced hearing loss then, I talked about temporary and permanent, and then age adjustment, and you want to be able to, usually what I have found is that there's about a 5 to 7 dB adjustment with age as you go out. So if you start to see that notch right there and you say, well, that's noise-induced, if they factor in the age, they actually put in a little more of a buffer there and say, well, you can have an adjustment about 5 to 7 dB. Beyond that, that accounts for aging up, which I think is kind of interesting. And these are the differences right here in terms of shifting as you see the audiometry test. Here you are in terms of audiometry test in hertz. Notice how they start to increase as you get older. We're not talking that much older. Required for all workers, 29, that's the Code of Federal Regulations, by the way, that's what CFR means, 1910-95, and a time-weighted average of 85 dB or more. You have to have programs for noise monitoring, audiometry testing, and follow-up and referral, implement controls, use of hearing protection, employee training, record keeping. Of all the things I do, and this is a message to the hygienist, I probably get more calls on something like this. When you think about ergonomics, it's a physical agent, so ergonauts tend to deal with things like noise and lighting and vibration and radiation and so on. But noise is one of the more common things I get called on to go out and to evaluate and so on. So if you're thinking, I love this profession, I want to get into this a little bit more, One of the specialty areas you may want to think about is noise, because one, we don't have enough really good acoustical experts out there, and two, it pays really well, pays extremely well. Why? Because look at all these programs that have to be implemented because of this. To me, it's a no-brainer if you want to go into this area and specialize. So noise control procedures, engineering the source. Obviously, this is encasement and so on. Vibration dampening, springs, etc. Engineering of the transmission path. Administrative controls spread the dose over the workforce. In other words, people rotating in and out of noisy areas. And then PPE, right, wearing the muffs, the earplugs, and so on. Engineering controls, high frequency noise, barriers, dampening, and distance. I'll hold you responsible for this. Low frequency, total enclosure, goes around barriers, less dampening, except for the really low frequencies, right? Unless you have it on dampening elements that cannot translate to the ground, it will communicate to you, and you will feel it. You will feel the noise. This is fun. I'm going to hold you responsible for this. Dr. Z used to always do this with 2 noise level meters, and he would say, "Look how cool this stuff is," and he'll get 2 noise levels, and say, he'll have one group shout, another group shout, and then both of you shout together, that kind of thing. But what's interesting about it is that numerical difference in terms of adding together is that if there's not a difference between, let's say, this side making a bunch of noise and this side making a bunch of noise in terms of putting the 2 together, you think, well, additive, it's going to be much greater. Turns out it's not. It's only going to be, at best, things being equivalent in terms of the sound coming out, only 3 dB higher. And you say, wow, that's kind of interesting. Doesn't really make a difference. Remember, it's on a log scale, so it does make a difference, but not as much as you think. And then as you increase right here, so let's say this group is really energized and making a lot more noise. Let's say you're at 80, and this group is much more diminutive, and they're, at best they're cranking out, say 65, right? What it shows here is that this group, because the difference is 15, 80 versus 65 right there, that you're not going to see any difference in that noise level. In other words, this group is basically going to dominate, and whatever you're kicking in doesn't matter. It's not going to add anything to it. It's only when it's equivalent that it adds to the 2. Why? Because it's sound pressure, right? That's what you're dealing with. So, administrative controls, rotating, brake areas, not as effective as engineering. Hearing protection, obviously earmuffs, performed based on the seal, not the insulation. So it's really important. I mean, I love some of these over-the-ear systems. When I travel, I do a lot of traveling. I'll take my Bose system with me, and you turn that on. Keep in mind, it's putting out a sound pressure level that is the opposite of the noise that's being picked up in the cabin. Your ear is still getting sound pressure, right? It's still feeling that pressure, but it's dampening what you recognize, right, in terms of the irritating noises that you hear in the cabin. Problem is that with me, when I wear those things, my head gets warm, and so they get all sweaty and nasty. I hate the over-the-ear ones, so I just usually have the ones that just sit on the ear, right? I prefer that. And a lot of people who wear hearing protection also feel the same. If they're working hard and they're sweating in these things, the muffs don't really work that well at all. But then the ones that you insert in the ear, those can make a big difference as well, if they're properly seated. Because a lot of times, the ones that annoy me the most are those little foam guys that you kind of roll up, and you stick. There's a technique, by the way. The hygienists know this, but if you don't, whenever you go into a noisy place, you grab the tip of your ear like this, you pull it up, roll up that piece, stick that in there, and wiggle it in. And what that does is straightens out the ear canal, and then it'll start to fill up and then plug it in. It really has to sound like you're congested and it's plugged. That way you know you have a good seal. But usually the technique is rather than just leaving it alone trying to stuff it in there, it doesn't straighten it out. So that's a technique that you're taught when you're inserting your earplugs in and out. I prefer to have the ones with the baffles. That works a little bit better for me when I use them. So the earplugs, the insert type, pre-molded and so on, and the training and education for these is such that I do with my thing here. I don't know what I did. increasing awareness of what's going on really helps, and then audiometry testing is really important. There it is. Black on black, not a good thing. Okay, issues with hearing protection then. Noise reduction is ideal, but half of rated is normal. So a lot of times they have what you'll see on the side, it'll say 35 noise reduction rating. And they say, well, okay, 35. Well, that's under ideal conditions. Usually you're not going to get that. So as a rule of thumb, it's going to be about half that. So if you're in a situation where, you're say 110 dB, and it's saying it's rated at 35, you're lucky if you're getting about 15 to 18 of that, which still means that you're going to be over your exposure, over the 90. So you have to be very careful about that. Transmission, the hearing protective devices, it's small with plugs, more with muffs due to the larger surface area. Frequent communication is needed, must be used. Clean hands are needed to insert the plugs and so on, so you won't infect your ears. Bone conductions can easily be controlled through the use of tight-fitting helmets, and motivation to control use or when it's used. Hair, glasses, pore adjustment, insert depth, and so on, all can impact on hearing devices. So very quickly, I've gone through the anatomy and physiology of the ear as it relates to noise, about some protection and so on. But if I'm sending around a noise level meter, the one that I'm going to use is dBA, dBB, or dBc? dBA, right? Because it most naturally aligns with the human response of the ear. All right. So don't be stressed if my pace is a little quick. It's not. It's really important material, and the reason I want to get through this is very important. But the next thing, and it's looking more like I'm probably going to have to do that on, what's today, Tuesday? I'll have to do that on Thursday, is on the whole issue of violence and terrorism and so on. It's just, each year I teach this class, that becomes a bigger and bigger issue as it relates to this course. So I'm going to move through kind of quickly, but I'm going to pause, and when I make a point and highlight it, that's what you want to do, is make a note on your notes, okay, that's important. I'm sorry? Okay, someone said something? No. Hearing things now. You knew about all that noise in the workplace, right? All right, so shift work, this is important for you to know because what does it mean? So shift work can refer to any shift that is not banker's hours. That means 8 to 5. Any shift that's not banker's hours means any shift, and this is, most of you know this, but a lot of times I sometimes jump ahead and don't show respect to my international students. And that is banker's hours in this country means 8 to 5. And that was one of the reasons actually why you saw in the quiz question, I asked Josh to put the color blocks up there because, fire engine red may mean nothing except to us, or lime green, which is a mixed color, which is that right there, may mean nothing except to us because of our orientation to this kind of thing. So I'm taking a little more time to make sure I explain these things. So if you get a quiz question that said, what is shift work? And then if you see one of the answers being 8 to 5, 8 a.m. to 5 p.m., that's wrong. It's not, right? So that's what banker's hours mean. Actually, it's even a push because most banks don't open until 9. But so basically, it's typical for night work to refer to shift work, rotating or alternating shifts. The work schedule requires the employees to work more than one shift. That employees to switch from one to another according to a certain cycle or pattern of shift rotation. They do this a lot in the military. When I was in the service, I did this, and we always rotated forward. They found that rotating backward was actually much more fatiguing, meaning that if I worked from 8 to 5 on a shift, then when I would come, actually 8 to 4 to break it up, 8 to 4, when I would come in, I would have a day off, and then I'd come in and I'd work from 4 to midnight, and then day off, and then I work from midnight to 8. And that's how everything is. Everything's shifted forward now. If you're working on alternating shifts, make a note of that. It's not shifting backwards is much more fatigued. In other words, clipping 8 hours from you. And as many of you already know, in healthcare, your hours now have been expanded to 10 to 12 hours, 12-hour shifts. And those are very long shifts to work. And it's It's getting more out of fewer people is what the problem is there, but also there are increases in mental errors and so on and fatigue as a result of that. So why shift work? It facilitates round-the-clock operations. Think of any operations you can't shut down. Foundry, steel mills, if you go up to Gary, Indiana, you shut those things down, everything hardens up, right? So you've got to keep operations going on all the time. Production now, the scheduling, a lot of robotics brought in, you don't have to shut down. You spread the capital over more units of production. Emergency responders, think about those that are always on site. If you go to the emergency room, they have to have people there, right? It doesn't matter what time of night. Military for obvious reasons, technology, advances, automation for continuous operations, and we have actually a global economy where shift work is critical to keep the global financial engine running. And it's a relatively new phenomenon when you think about it, in terms of your life, where your age is right now. But in my life cycle, what I'm looking at is that there weren't very many operations that went 24/7. Very few when I was your age. Pretty much at the end of the day, things shut down. The stores would stay open until about 9 at night, but that was it. You didn't see any of this stuff. And then Thanksgiving. Don't get me going on Thanksgiving, which I consider to be a sacred day. Look how they've ruined it, right? You just, making everyone work on Thanksgiving. Doggone it, makes me mad. Anyways, that's a side story. Edit that out, Mike. So, shift work facts from NIOSH. About 50.5 million people in the U.S. Work irregular shifts. 15.5. Sorry about that. In the U.S., 15.5 people, that's it. Yeah, not much. We don't have to worry about it. 15 million. Sorry about it. I don't know how that missed. And then 23 million people work irregular shifts, meaning not 8 to 5. Shift work may disrupt the body's internal circadian rhythm, resulting in sleep loss, and being overly tired can make it difficult to concentrate and increase the possibility of error in your job. And digestive problems come up. Lots of digestive issues out there, heart problems and stress, interference with family life and social life and so on. And it is a fact, it is a known fact, that college students do not get enough sleep on average. Some of you do. Some of you sleep 8 to 10 hours a day. You think, wow, 10 hours, my God, are you kidding? And previously, the last time I had a 10-hour sleep was when I went home and I didn't have anything to worry about, right? Well, you're chronically short on sleep. So it's something to think about in terms of what you need. Can't get around it. So for thousands of years, we've actually come up with the sun, right? It went down when the sun went down, but it's only in the past century where we've had electricity to keep us up for long hours. Now we have a 24-hour society, and we have a lot of economic pressures to keep us awake. Understanding the effect of shift work on the circadian rhythm at the center of understanding this challenges is really dealing with some of the safety issues that come into play for shift work. So I'm going to hold you responsible for this. Your hypothalamus is very important in terms of the circadian rhythm. Humans have a 24-hour repeating process. The circadian rhythm is actually controlled by the hypothalamus, which also, what's the other thing that the hypothalamus controls that we've already covered in this class? Core temperature, right? So when you have the failure of that hypothalamus, in particular the anterior hypothalamus, it's basically like the thermostat in your body going awry, right? It heats up that core temperature and leads to heat stroke. So here's yet another important part for that gland that it plays in terms of your sleep rest and sleep awake cycles. So the hypothalamus then manages the functions of the core body temperature as mentioned, release of hormones in the blood, cognitive ability, as well as wakefulness and sleep on a daily basis. So our circadian clock, first of all, there was a lot of debate about, do we really have this, or is it just, are we governed by when the sun comes up and when it goes down? We actually do. Circadian rhythm then is a rhythmic activity cycle based on 24-hour intervals exhibited by many organisms, not just us. It's been out for some time, and we've known that. The world, so do we have a clock on our body?